August 2007. Approximately 6:05 in the evening, local time, in Minneapolis, Minnesota. The I-35W bridge spanning the Mississippi River collapses into the water and onto the riverbank below during evening rush hour traffic. 13 people are killed. 145 are injured. The bridge had stood since 1967, carrying interstate traffic across the river for 40 years without a catastrophic structural failure. This script does not begin with speculation about what happened that evening. It begins with what investigators found afterward, working backward from the wreckage to the design documents, and then further back to a single category of steel component that had been wrong since the day the bridge was built. The final report from the National Transportation Safety Board, released in 2008, identified the primary root cause. Gusset plates in the original 1967 design were undersized from the start. Not damaged, not corroded beyond spec, undersized, an error present in the engineering from the beginning, one that passed through decades of inspection cycles without being caught. That is the starting fact of this case. Everything that follows is not a story about sudden failure. It is a story about a latent defect that existed for 40 years, and a set of decisions, made incrementally and separately over 4 decades, that eventually applied enough load to that defect to expose it. The bridge did not fail because of one dramatic event on August 1, 2007. It failed because a design flaw that should have been caught in 1967 was never caught, and because everything added to the bridge afterward was never checked against that original, flawed calculation. This is a case about what happens when the assumption of structural soundness is inherited across 40 years of infrastructure management without being re-verified. The gusset plates were the trigger point, but the exposure of that trigger point took 4 decades to build. To understand how a 1967 design flaw remained hidden until 2007, you have to look at what happened to the bridge in the years between construction and collapse, not in terms of any single dramatic event, but in terms of accumulated weight. Between 1967 and 2007, the dead load carried by the I-35W bridge nearly doubled. This did not happen through any single decision. It happened through a series of additions made over decades. A concrete overlay added to the deck, guardrails installed or upgraded, light standards added along the span. Each of these additions, on its own, likely seemed minor at the time it was made, a maintenance improvement, a safety upgrade, a modernization. But none of them were recalculated against the bridge's original structural design. The gusset plates that held the steel truss members together were sized for the load conditions of 1967. By 2007, the load sitting on those same plates was nearly double what the original calculation assumed. This is the mechanism by which a hidden design flaw becomes an active structural risk, not through any new error, but through the slow, uninspected accumulation of weight on top of an old and unverified assumption. Then came the day of the collapse itself. On August 1, 2007, construction work was underway on the bridge deck. Approximately 578 tons of construction material and equipment were staged and concentrated on the specific span that ultimately failed. This was not distributed evenly across the structure. It was concentrated load, sitting directly on a section of bridge whose underlying connective steel had already been carrying, for years, nearly twice its designed capacity. The undersized gusset plates had survived 4 decades of gradually increasing dead load. They did not survive the addition of a concentrated, several hundred-ton load staged for a specific day's construction work. The failure sequence that the NTSB reconstructed afterward is not a story of one mistake. It's a story of a design error from 1967, compounded by decades of unrecalculated load additions, triggered by a specific and concentrated load event on a single day. Each layer made the next layer more dangerous, and none of the layers were, on their own, treated as a structural red flag. The NTSB's final report in 2008 was direct about where responsibility for the collapse ultimately sat. The undersized gusset plates, present in the original 1967 design, were identified as the primary root cause. But the report's finding raises a harder question that sits underneath the metallurgy and the load calculations. How does an error like this survive 40 years of bridge inspection without being caught? The available facts point to a structural gap in how the bridge was managed over its operating life, not just how it was designed. Bridge inspection, as practiced through most of that 40-year period, was built around checking the visual and physical integrity of individual components, looking for corrosion, cracking, wear, and visible damage on the steel that was already there. What that inspection regime was not built to do was recalculate whether the bridge's original design capacity still matched what the bridge was actually carrying. Every time a concrete overlay was added, every time guardrails were upgraded, every time light standards were installed, those additions went through their own individual approval processes as maintenance or safety improvements. None of the available facts indicate that any of those additions triggered a full recalculation of the bridge's original structural load assumptions. The system treated the original 1967 design as a fixed, trusted baseline, and layered decades of physical additions on top of that baseline without retesting whether the baseline itself was sound, or whether it could still bear what was now being asked of it. This is the institutional root cause underneath the physical one. A management and inspection process that was designed to catch visible deterioration, but not designed to catch the cumulative effect of load growth against a design that had been wrong since day one. The gusset plates were never flagged in 4 decades, not because anyone actively ignored a known problem, but because the inspection framework in place had no mechanism to ask the question that mattered: does the original calculations still hold, given everything we've added since? That gap is precisely what the collapse exposed, and it is why the consequences of this failure extended well past the physical wreckage in the Mississippi River. On the evening of August 1, 2007, the failure of a structural connection that had been miscalculated in 1967 translated into immediate physical human harm. 13 people were killed. 145 were injured. These were commuters and drivers who had no way of knowing that the steel gusset plates beneath the deck they were crossing had been undersized since the bridge's construction, that the dead load on that structure had nearly doubled over 4 decades without a corresponding recalculation, or that construction material weighing approximately 578 tons was concentrated on the specific span they were driving across that evening. None of this was visible to the people on the bridge. There was no warning available to them, based on the facts of this case, because the deficiency itself had not been identified by the inspection processes responsible for catching it. This is the sharp edge of what an undetected design flaw means in practice. The people affected are not the engineers who miscalculated the original plates in 1967, and not the officials who approved decades of additions without recalculation. They are the ordinary people using the infrastructure as it was presented to them, as safe, inspected, and structurally sound. The gap between an institutional failure to recalculate cumulative load, on one hand, and 13 deaths and 145 injuries, on the other, is the entire distance this case travels. It is worth sitting with the scale of that distance. A structural engineering error, present since 1967 and never flagged through 40 years of inspection cycles, combined with ordinary maintenance decisions made over decades. A concrete overlay here, guardrails there, light standards installed at some point, none of which were individually reckless, and none of which were checked against the original design math. Then a specific day, in 2007, when several hundred tons of construction material sat on the wrong span at the wrong time. The people crossing that bridge that evening were the ones who bore the entire accumulated weight of every decision, and every non-decision made about that structure since it opened. Infrastructure failures of this kind rarely announce themselves in advance to the public using the structure. The warning signs, when they exist, sit inside engineering reports and inspection records, not on the road surface itself. That is precisely why the process failures described in this case, the absence of a recalculation trigger, the inspection framework built around visible damage rather than cumulative load, are not abstract administrative details. They are the mechanism by which a decades-old design error became a lethal, present-tense event for the people using the bridge on one specific evening. In the aftermath of the collapse, the NTSB's 2008 final report did not stop at identifying the undersized gusset plates as the primary root cause. The investigation's findings fed directly into a change in how bridges are inspected across the United States. Following this case, U.S. bridge inspection standards were revised to add a specific new requirement. Inspectors must now check accumulated load on a structure, not simply the visual integrity of its individual components. This is a direct, traceable response to the exact gap this case exposed, a 40-year period during which a structure's dead load nearly doubled through incremental additions, none of which triggered a review of whether the original design could still support what the bridge was now carrying. The new standard exists because the old one, as practiced on the I-35W bridge, was not built to ask that question. It's worth being precise about what changed and what the available facts do not tell us. The facts of this case establish the technical chain clearly. An undersized 1967 design, undetected for decades, exposed by accumulated dead load growth, and then triggered by a concentrated construction load on a single day. They establish the human toll with equal clarity: 13 dead, 145 injured. And they establish the institutional response: a revision to inspection standards nationwide, expanding what inspectors are required to evaluate. What this case ultimately demonstrates, within the bounds of what is documented here, is that a structure can pass every inspection built around visible component condition and still be carrying a fatal, invisible deficit, one that was present from the first day of construction and compounded, unnoticed, through every subsequent addition made to the bridge over 40 years. The concrete overlay, the guardrails, the light standards, none of these were, individually, unreasonable investments in a functioning piece of infrastructure. The failure was not any one of those additions. It was the absence of a mechanism requiring that each of them be checked against the structural math the bridge was originally built on. The I-35W collapse changed that. It added a check that had not existed before, specifically because its absence had already been shown, in the most direct way possible, to be insufficient. That is where the documented record of this case ends, not with a single villain or a single decision, but with a 40-year gap between design and verification, closed only after it had already produced the loss of 13 lives.